July 21, 1456. Day 18 of Hell. Ottoman banners rose on Christian walls. The Janissaries were inside the citadel. Europe's last fortress on the Danube was falling. What happened in the next 3 hours would echo for 600 years. A Hungarian soldier stood on what remained of Belgrade's eastern rampart. His name is lost to history. His experience is not. 18 days without real sleep. Powder burns marking his forearms like black tattoos. His left ear had stopped working 5 days earlier when a cannonball struck the wall 3 feet from where he crouched. He looked out at the city he had sworn to defend. It no longer existed. Where the lower town once sprawled, merchant homes, workshops, the small chapel where families had worshipped for generations, there was nothing but ash and scorched timber. Ottoman soldiers occupied those ruins now. Green banners planted in soil that Christian feet had walked for 2 centuries. The great walls were broken teeth jutting from bleeding gums of rubble. Gaps wide enough to ride a horse through. Stone that had weathered 200 years of storms could not weather 2 weeks of Ottoman artillery. And the smell. Bodies floated in the moat. Bodies lay stacked against the chapel walls because no one had strength left to dig graves. July heat was doing its work. Men wrapped cloth around their faces just to breathe. The constant thunder of bombardment had stopped an hour ago. After 18 days of endless cannon fire, the silence felt wrong, unnatural. Men looked at each other with hollow eyes, ears still ringing, unable to process the absence of noise. Then someone grabbed his shoulder. Another soldier pointing east. Mouth moving but sounds impossible to understand through damaged hearing. He followed the pointing finger. White caps. Hundreds of them. Thousands. Climbing the breaches. Planting banners on the battlements. The Janissaries were inside. But here is what makes this story different from every other siege you have heard about. The men who saved Belgrade were not young warriors in their prime. They were 70 years old. Both of them. And both of them were dying. One was a warlord who had spent 40 years fighting Ottomans. A man so feared that Turkish mothers used his name to frighten children into obedience. Now fever was eating him from within. Some days he could barely stand. Everyone who saw him knew he did not have long. The other was a Franciscan friar. 4 feet tall. Skeletal from decades of fasting. He had never held a sword in his life. He commanded an army of 20,000 peasants armed with pitchforks and scythes. A dying general. A fanatical priest. Farmers with farm tools. Against the greatest military power on earth. Against the same army that had broken Constantinople 3 years earlier. Against the Sultan who had proven that no fortress was unconquerable. And they won. Before we go further, I want to know something. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your city in the comments. I read every single one. I want to see how far this story travels. How many corners of the world are learning about the 19 days that changed European history? And if this story grips you the way it gripped me when I first discovered it, hit subscribe. This channel digs up the history that time tried to bury. The battles everyone forgot. The people who should be remembered. Now, back to the walls. Back to the moment when everything was about to break. The man commanding Belgrade's defense was János Hunyadi. For 40 years, he had been the nightmare that kept Ottoman commanders awake at night. He had smashed their armies at niche. He had raided deep into their territory, burning supply depots, ambushing columns, teaching them that Christians could strike back. He had already saved Belgrade once before in 1440, driving off an Ottoman siege when he was still in his prime. But that was 16 years ago. Now Hunyadi was 70 years old. Some wasting illness had been consuming him for months. Fever came and went unpredictably. Some days he could ride. Other days he could barely stand. His skin had taken on the gray pallor of a man whose body was surrendering. Food held no appeal. Sleep brought no rest. His physicians spoke in hushed tones. His officers exchanged knowing glances. Everyone understood. János Hunyadi was dying. When messengers brought word that Sultan Mehmed was marching north with the army that had broken Constantinople, Hunyadi received the news in his sickbed. He listened silently, asked questions about numbers, artillery, supply lines. Then he rose, called for his armor, and announced he was going to Belgrade. His senior officer protested. "My lord, you cannot." "I have been dying for months," Hunyadi interrupted. "I will choose where I finish." But here is the part no one expected. Hunyadi understood military mathematics. He counted his available forces. He counted the enemy's reported strength. The numbers meant certain defeat. He needed more men than Hungary's paralyzed nobility would give him. The kingdom was collapsing from within. King Ladislas was 15 years old, a boy controlled by feuding noble families who spent more energy destroying each other than defending their realm. The treasury was empty. The army was scattered across 100 minor garrisons. Western Europe offered prayers and nothing else. The Pope called for a crusade. No one came. Hungary would face this storm alone. Then something arrived that Hunyadi never expected. A 4-foot-tall friar, leading 20,000 peasants, carrying pitchforks in absolute faith. Giovanni di Capistrano was everything Hunyadi was not. 70 years old, same age as the warlord, but where Hunyadi was a professional soldier who trusted steel and tactics, Capistrano trusted only God. Decades of fasting had reduced his body to sinew stretched over bone. He ate once daily, bread and water, nothing more. He slept on bare ground even when offered beds. He had been a lawyer once, a governor in Naples, a man of worldly power, until a vision in a prison cell turned him towards spiritual warfare. The Pope had given him a mission: raise a crusade to save Belgrade. Capistrano approached this task with the fervor of a man who believed he was living through the Book of Revelation. He traveled through German lands and into Hungary, appearing in village squares with a banner depicting Christ on the cross. He did not request audiences with nobles. He spoke directly to the people who had nothing. His sermons were not gentle. He described Constantinople's fall, churches converted to mosques, priests butchered at their altars, Christian children torn from their mothers' arms and marched into slavery. Then came the promise that changed everything. Any man who died fighting the Turks would bypass purgatory entirely, straight to heaven. No centuries of suffering for sins. Immediate salvation. For peasants who had been taught that their sins condemned them to generations of torment after death, this was revolutionary. Die fighting. Wake up in paradise. Thousands believed. Thousands followed. They came with whatever they owned. Scythes still stained from last year's harvest. Pitchforks. Wood-cutting axes. Hunting bows that had never been aimed at anything larger than deer. Kitchen knives. Clubs. A few had swords, ancient, rusted, inherited from grandfathers who had fought in wars now forgotten. Almost none had armor. One man wore a cooking pot strapped to his head with leather thongs. But they had faith. Absolute. Unshakable. By the time Capistrano reached the Danube, his crusade numbered between 20 and 30,000. Not all could fight. Women had refused to stay behind, children followed, old men who could barely walk insisted on joining. But the fighting force was perhaps 20,000. 20,000 peasants who had never trained for war. Led by a friar who had never commanded troops in his life. Marching toward the greatest army in the world. In the chaos of the final assault, something struck Sultan Mehmed himself. An arrow. A crossbow bolt. Sources disagree on the details. What they agree on, he would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. But how a mob of peasants reached the most protected man in the Ottoman Empire, how they breached his personal camp and sent the conqueror of Constantinople fleeing, that comes later. First, you need to understand what they were facing. You need to understand why Belgrade mattered. And you need to understand what had happened 3 years earlier, when the walls that had protected Christendom for 11 centuries finally fell. And a 21-year-old sultan proved that nothing in this world was unconquerable anymore. Belgrade sat exactly where two rivers embraced, the Danube and the Sava. Look at a map. The Danube is the highway of Central Europe. It connects the Black Sea to the heart of German lands. Whoever controls the Danube controls trade, military movement, communication, everything. Belgrade was the lock on that door. Beyond Belgrade lay Hungary. Beyond Hungary, Vienna. Beyond Vienna, the soft underbelly of Western Christendom. If Mehmed took Belgrade, the road to Europe's heart lay wide open. This was not just a fortress. This was the gate. And the Sultan who had broken Constantinople wanted it open. Here is what I need you to understand before we go further. This is not just a battle story. This is the moment that bought Europe 70 years. Without these 19 days, there is no Renaissance spreading peacefully northward. Without Belgrade holding, Ottoman armies threatened Vienna decades earlier. The entire trajectory of Western civilization shifts. 2 dying old men. An army of farmers. 19 days of hell. That is what stood between Mehmed and everything he wanted. But Belgrade's last stand did not begin on July 21, 1456. It began 3 years earlier, in a city 1,000 miles away, when the walls that had protected Christendom for 11 centuries finally fell. And a 21-year-old sultan proved that with enough artillery and enough will, nothing was safe anymore. Constantinople. The city that had stood for over 1,000 years. It fell in less than 2 months. And the man who broke it was now marching toward Belgrade with the same guns. The same soldiers. The same absolute certainty that nothing could stop him. He was about to learn otherwise. For 11 centuries, Constantinople had been unconquerable. Every empire that tried to take it broke against those walls. Persians came with vast armies. They failed. Arabs came with religious fervor and numerical superiority. They failed. Vikings sailed down from the frozen north. They failed. Bulgars threw themselves against the defenses generation after generation. They failed. The walls were not just fortifications. They were a statement. A promise. Proof that some things in this world could not be destroyed. Triple walls. The outer wall rose 40 feet. Behind it, a second wall climbed 30 feet higher. Behind that, an inner wall added another 40 feet. Between each wall ran a moat. Towers every 50 yards provided overlapping fields of fire. Engineers who studied those defenses calculated that taking Constantinople by direct assault was mathematically impossible. You would run out of soldiers before you ran out of wall. For over 1,000 years that calculation held true. Then Mehmed II decided mathematics could be rewritten. He was 21 years old when he set his sights on Constantinople. Most sultans would have waited, consolidated power, built alliances, tested their armies against smaller targets first. Mehmed was not most sultans. He had inherited the throne at 19 after a childhood of palace intrigue and survival. His father had abdicated twice. Court factions had tried to use the young prince as a puppet. He had learned early that hesitation meant death. Now he wanted the one prize that had eluded every Ottoman sultan before him. The Queen of Cities, the Second Rome. The jewel that would prove he was greater than all who came before. His advisors urged caution. The walls were legendary. The defenders were experienced. The city had provisions to withstand a long siege. Western powers might send relief fleets. Mehmed listened to none of it. He had something no previous attacker had possessed. Dragons. Not the dragons of legend. Something worse. Bronze cannons so massive that they redefined what siege warfare meant. The largest was called Basilica. 27 feet long. A barrel so wide that a man could crawl inside. It required 60 oxen to move. 200 men to operate. When it fired, the explosion could be heard 10 miles away. The stone balls it launched weighed over 1,000 pounds. They traveled fast enough to shatter masonry on impact. Walls that had stopped every weapon for a millennium could not stop this. But Basilica was not alone. Mehmed assembled dozens of bombards. Smaller cannons that could fire more rapidly. Falconets and serpentines for anti-personnel work. An entire arsenal of gunpowder weapons that represented the cutting edge of military technology. The men who operated these guns came from across the known world. Hungarian engineers who had defected to Ottoman service. German mercenaries seeking fortune. Italian renegades fleeing justice. The best artillery minds available, all working for the Sultan. In early April 1453, this arsenal was positioned around Constantinople's walls. The thunder began. The bombardment was unlike anything defenders had experienced. Previous sieges involved catapults, trebuchets, weapons that threw stones in high arcs. giving defenders time to see them coming. Time to take cover. Cannons were different. The sound came first. A crack that split the air. Then the impact. Stone walls exploding inward. Fragments flying like shrapnel. Men standing in the wrong place simply ceased to exist. And it never stopped. Mehmed organized his gunners into rotating shifts. 8 hours firing. 8 hours resting. 24 hours a day. Day after day. Week after week. The defenders tried everything. They hung leather hides over the walls to absorb impact. The cannonballs tore through them. They built inner walls behind the breaches. The bombardment pulverized those too. They launched night raids to destroy the guns. Ottoman guards were waiting. By the end of April, the legendary walls were dying. Breaches opened. Towers collapsed. The mathematics that had protected Constantinople for 11 centuries no longer applied. But here is the part that shows you who Mehmed really was. The city held for 53 days. 53 days of bombardment. 53 days of assaults and repulsed attacks. 53 days of defenders fighting with desperate courage. Any other commander might have accepted a negotiated surrender. Spare the city. Take tribute. Declare victory and go home. Mehmed wanted more than victory. He wanted the world to understand that a new age had begun. On May 29, 1453, he ordered the final assault. The attack came before dawn. Wave after wave of Ottoman soldiers pouring toward the breaches. The first waves were expendable troops. Men sent to exhaust the defenders. To fill the ditches with bodies if necessary. Behind them came the professionals. Anatolian infantry. Sipahi cavalry dismounted for the assault. And behind them came the Janissaries. The Janissaries were unlike any soldiers in the world. They were slaves, taken as boys from Christian families across the Balkans, converted to Islam, raised in barracks where every day was training for war. They knew nothing but military discipline. They feared nothing but failure. By 1453, they were the finest infantry force in existence. Better trained than any European knights. More disciplined than any mercenary company. Absolutely loyal to the Sultan who had made them what they were. 10,000 of them waited behind the assault waves. Fresh, ready, unstoppable. When the defenders had exhausted themselves against the earlier attacks, the Janissaries advanced. They moved in disciplined formations. Shields locked. Composite bows firing coordinated volleys. Swords drawn only when they reached striking distance. They hit the breaches like a wave of white-capped death. The defenders broke. Emperor Constantine XI knew it was over. He was the last of his line. The final heir to a title that stretched back to Augustus Caesar. The emperor of a realm that had shrunk to a single city. A city that was now falling around him. His advisors urged him to flee. A ship waited in the harbor. He could escape to the west. Raise armies. Return someday to reclaim his throne. Constantine refused. He removed his imperial regalia. The purple robes. The crown. Everything that marked him as emperor. He put on the armor of a common soldier. Then he drew his sword and walked toward the fighting. His last words were reportedly a prayer, asking God to accept his soul, acknowledging that his city was lost. He died in the streets, fighting hand to hand. No one saw him fall. When they found his body later, they identified him only by his boots. Purple leather embroidered with golden eagles. The last emperor of Rome. Headless. Trampled by thousands of feet. Identified by his footwear. The city burned for 3 days. Mehmed had promised his soldiers 3 days of plunder. It was traditional. The reward for taking a city by assault rather than negotiation. Churches were looted. Homes were ransacked. Men were killed. Women were taken. Children were gathered for the slave markets. The great cathedral of Hagia Sophia, where emperors had been crowned for 9 centuries, was converted to a mosque before sunset on the first day. When the 3 days ended, Mehmed rode through the ruins of the city he had conquered. He was 21 years old. He had accomplished what no one in history had managed. He had broken the unconquerable city. He reportedly wept at the destruction. Or perhaps that is legend. What is not legend is what he said when he surveyed the ruins. What a city we have given over to plunder and destruction. Whether those were tears of regret or satisfaction, no one knows. What matters is what happened after. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves across Europe. You need to understand what that city meant to Christendom. It was not just a political capital. It was a symbol, a promise, proof that Christian civilization could endure against any threat. For over 1,000 years, whenever armies threatened from the east, Constantinople stood as the shield, the wall that protected everything behind it. Now the wall was gone. Refugees flooded westward with horror stories. Scholars fled carrying ancient manuscripts that would fuel the Renaissance. Merchants scrambled to find new trade routes because the old ones now ran through Ottoman territory. And in every court, every cathedral, every village square, the same question echoed. If Constantinople can fall, what cannot? The psychological impact was devastating. Popes called for crusades. Kings made grand promises. Nobles spoke of holy vengeance. Almost nothing materialized. Western Europe was fractured. France and England had barely finished their 100 Years' War. The German states squabbled endlessly over precedence and territory. Italian city-states were too busy fighting each other to unite against a common threat. Everyone agreed something must be done. No one agreed on what, or when, or who should lead. And while Europe argued, Mehmed consolidated his conquest and looked for his next target. Here is what Mehmed understood that European rulers did not. Artillery had changed everything. Before cannons, a well-built fortress could hold against armies 10 times its size. Walls bought time. Time for relief forces to arrive. Time for attackers to exhaust their supplies. Time for disease to thin enemy ranks. The mathematics of siege warfare favored defenders. Always had. That was why Constantinople had stood for 11 centuries. Cannons reversed the equation. Now a besieging army could reduce walls to rubble in weeks. The strongest fortress was only as strong as its walls. And walls could not stop cannonballs. Mehmed had proven this at Constantinople. He intended to prove it again. And again. And again. Until nothing stood between him and complete domination. His next target was already selected. The fortress that controlled the Danube. The gate to Hungary. The lock on the door to Western Europe. Belgrade. The march north began in early summer 1456. Mehmed assembled an army that made Constantinople's assault force look modest. Estimates vary wildly, medieval chroniclers exaggerated, but even conservative counts agree this was massive. 60,000 men. Perhaps 80,000. Perhaps more. Sipahi cavalry in gleaming mail. Provincial infantry from every corner of the empire. Akinci raiders who specialized in terror and reconnaissance. Engineers. Sappers. Siege specialists. And the Janissaries. 10 to 12,000 of them. The same soldiers who had broken Constantinople's walls. Fresh and ready for another conquest. And of course the dragons. The same artillery that had murdered Constantinople. Hauled north by teams of oxen. Hundreds of tons of bronze death rolling toward Belgrade. Village after village emptied as the Ottoman host advanced. Refugees clogged the roads. Families carrying whatever they could grab. Children crying. Old people struggling to keep pace. Everyone moving in the same direction. Away. They carried stories of what was coming. An army that stretched to the horizon. Cannons that could level mountains. Soldiers who did not fear death because paradise awaited them. By late June, every European power knew Mehmed was coming for Belgrade. The responses were familiar. France expressed concern. England sent prayers. The German states debated. The Pope called for a crusade. No one sent soldiers. Hungary would face the storm alone. With a 15-year-old king. An empty treasury. A scattered army. And feuding nobles who could not agree on anything. Almost alone. Because a dying warlord was rising from his sickbed. And a fanatical friar was marching south with 20,000 believers. The collision that would determine Europe's fate was 3 weeks away. Every military expert in Europe would have told you the same thing. Capistrano's crusaders were worthless. Peasants with farming tools cannot fight Janissaries. Men who have never trained for war cannot stand against soldiers who have trained since childhood. Faith does not stop swords. Prayer does not deflect arrows. Every calculation of military science said these people would die in minutes without achieving anything meaningful. Every calculation was wrong. But that discovery lay weeks ahead. First, the friar had to build his impossible army. Giovanni di Capistrano had not always been a holy man. Before the visions, before the fasting, before the decades of wandering through Europe with a crucifix in his hand, he had been something else entirely. A lawyer, a politician, a man who understood power and how to wield it. In his 20s he served as governor of Perugia. He navigated court intrigues. He accumulated wealth. He married into an influential family. He was climbing the ladder that ambitious men climbed in 15th century Italy. Then everything collapsed. A war between Italian city-states swept through his region. Capistrano was captured, thrown into prison, left to rot in darkness while his enemies decided his fate. In that cell, something broke inside him, or something awakened. He later claimed the Virgin Mary appeared to him. A vision so vivid, so overwhelming, that it burned away everything he had been. She told him to abandon worldly power, to surrender his wealth, to devote his remaining years to spiritual warfare. When he emerged from prison, he was a different man. He abandoned his wife, gave away his possessions, joined the Franciscan order, and began a transformation that would take 30 years to complete. By 1456, Capistrano had become something Europe had rarely seen: a celebrity preacher, a wandering prophet, a man whose very presence drew crowds by the thousands. He traveled constantly: Germany, Austria, Hungary, Poland. Wherever he went, word spread ahead of him. People walked for days just to hear him speak. His methods were calculated for maximum impact. He would arrive in a town square at noon. No advance notice. No formal invitation. Just this tiny skeletal figure appearing with his banner of Christ crucified, climbing onto whatever platform he could find. Then he would begin. The sermon started quietly, almost gentle. He spoke of Christ's suffering, of sacrifice, of redemption available to all who believed. Then his voice would rise. He described the Ottoman conquest in terms designed to horrify. Holy icons smashed, nuns dragged from convents, men executed in front of their sons, entire families sold at auction like cattle, the cross torn down, the crescent raised. His voice would crack. Tears would stream down his gaunt cheeks. Real tears. He wept for Christendom. He wept for the souls of the lost. He wept until his audience wept with him. Then came the turn. He would raise his crucifix high. His voice would steadier, stronger, almost thunderous from such a small frame. God was offering a chance, a final chance. The Turks were coming. They had taken Constantinople. Now they wanted everything else. And God needed soldiers. Not knights. Not nobles. Not the powerful who had failed Christendom again and again. God needed the faithful, the ordinary, the forgotten. Then came the promise that changed everything. Any man who took up arms against the Turks and died fighting would bypass purgatory entirely. You need to understand what this meant to a medieval peasant. Purgatory was not abstract theology. It was a terrifying certainty. You would die. Your soul would be judged. And unless you had lived a nearly perfect life, impossible for anyone who worked fields, told lies, felt anger, experienced lust, you would spend centuries in purifying fire. Centuries. Suffering for every sin, every impure thought, every moment of weakness. The rich could buy their way out. Indulgences, masses set for their souls, donations to churches that would remember them in prayers. The poor had nothing. They would suffer the longest. They always did. Now Capistrano offered a shortcut. Die fighting Turks. Wake up in paradise. Immediately. No waiting. No fire. No centuries of agony. For people who had been taught their entire lives that suffering awaited them after death, this was liberation. And then there were the miracles. Whether real or staged or products of mass hysteria, historians still debate. What matters is that people believed. In Nuremberg, a woman brought her daughter who could not walk. Capistrano placed his hands on the girl's legs, prayed. The crowd swore she rose and walked. In Vienna, a man blind in one eye claimed sight returned after Capistrano touched him. In village after village, the stories multiplied. The lame walked. The sick recovered. The dying rallied. Word spread faster than any messenger could ride. A holy man was traveling through the land. He could heal. He could promise heaven. He was calling soldiers for God's final battle. Who answered that call? Not the powerful, the powerless. The structure of medieval society was simple. At the top, nobility who owned everything. Below them, knights who fought for nobles. Below them, free farmers who worked land they did not own. At the bottom, serfs, bound to land they could never leave without permission. Capistrano's message reached the bottom. Peasants who gave 60% of every harvest to lords who did nothing but collect. Men who worked from dawn until dark every day of their lives. Men whose children would work the same fields. Whose grandchildren would work the same fields. No escape. No hope. No future except more of the same. Criminals rotting in local jails. Thieves. Poachers who had taken deer from noble forests to feed their families. Men facing execution or mutilation for offenses born of desperation. They were offered pardons if they took the cross. Serbian refugees. Thousands of them scattered across Hungary. Their homeland had fallen to Ottoman conquest. Their families were dead or enslaved. They lived as displaced outsiders in foreign towns. Burning with grief. Burning with rage. Desperate for any chance at revenge. Old men told they were useless. Too weak for farm labor. Too old to contribute. Burdens on families who could barely feed themselves. Men with nothing left to offer except a willingness to die for something that mattered. Capistrano spoke to all of them. He told them they were not worthless. They were not forgotten. They were chosen. God did not need nobles. God needed believers. And believers could defeat empires. They came by thousands. From German villages. From Austrian towns. From Hungarian farms. From Serbian refugee camps. They heard the call and they answered. They brought whatever they had. Scythes that had cut wheat for generations. Pitchforks that had moved hay. Axes that had felled trees. Butcher knives. Hunting bows. Clubs carved from oak branches. Some had actual weapons. Old swords passed down from grandfathers. Rusted spears. Battered helmets that had not seen battle in decades. Most had nothing but faith. One man reportedly arrived wearing a cooking pot on his head. He had nothing else that might stop a sword. The pot was his helmet. His only armor. They marched with Capistrano's banner at the front. Christ crucified. A reminder of suffering. A promise of redemption. Hymns echoed across the countryside as they walked. Thousands of voices raised in songs of praise. They were marching toward almost certain death. They sang anyway. By the time the crusade reached the Danube in late June, it numbered between 20 and 30,000. Not all could fight. Women had refused to stay behind. Some had husbands in the column. Others had no one left anywhere else. Children followed because their parents followed. Old men who could barely walk insisted on joining because they wanted to die for something. But the fighting force was perhaps 20,000. 20,000 peasants who had never trained for war. Led by a 4-foot-tall friar who had never commanded troops in his life. Marching toward the same army that had broken Constantinople. If you are still watching, you understand something most people miss about history. It is not made only by kings and generals. Sometimes it is made by the desperate, the forgotten, the people who have nothing left to lose. Drop a like if this story is hitting different than the history you learned in school. Share it with someone who needs to hear that ordinary people can change the world. Because what happens next, when these peasants meet the greatest military force on earth, will stay with you. János Hunyadi saw the Crusaders and his heart sank. 40 years as a professional soldier. 40 years learning what war actually required. Discipline, training, equipment, logistics, knowing when to advance, knowing when to retreat, knowing that courage without competence was just a faster way to die. He looked at Capistrano's army and saw none of that. chaos instead of formation, farm tools instead of weapons, work clothes instead of armor. Men organized by which village they came from instead of military units. Against Ottoman provincial troops they might cause confusion. Against Janissaries they would be slaughtered in minutes. He met with Capistrano privately. The conversation was tense. "They cannot fight on the walls," Hunyadi said. "Put them in the line and they will break at the first assault." Every professional soldier knows this. Capistrano's sunken eyes met his without flinching. God did not bring them here to hide behind walls. God did not bring them here to die uselessly either. No death in his service is useless. 20,000 corpses will not stop the Ottomans. Discipline might. Faith will stop them. Faith stopped armies before. Faith can stop them again. They argued for hours. Two stubborn old men. Both dying. Both certain they were right. Hunyadi saw military reality. He had fought Janissaries before. He knew their discipline, their training, their absolute fearlessness. Sending peasants against them was murder, not strategy. Capistrano saw divine purpose. God had sent these people. God would protect them. To doubt that was to doubt God himself. Neither would yield completely. But neither would abandon Belgrade either. Hunyadi, because he had spent 40 years defending Hungary. He would not stop now. Not even dying. Capistrano, because he believed this was the prophesied battle. The final confrontation. Fleeing would mean damnation. They reached an uneasy compromise. Capistrano's crusaders would enter Belgrade. They would help defend the city. But Hunyadi would command all military operations. When the time came for fighting, if the crusaders fought at all, Hunyadi would decide where and how. Capistrano agreed. For now. Both men knew this agreement would not survive the reality of battle. When the walls started falling and the Janissaries started climbing, something would break. Either the Crusaders would prove their worth, or they would prove Hunyadi right. The answer would come on day 18. By early July, Belgrade's population had exploded. The garrison under Mihai Shalagi, Hunyadi's brother-in-law, numbered about 2,000. Professional soldiers. Men who knew the fortress. Men who had been preparing for weeks. Hunyadi arrived with his own force. 5,000 to 7,000 trained soldiers. Hungarian cavalry in chain mail. Serbian mercenaries hardened by years of frontier warfare. His personal household guard, 50 men who had followed him for decades. Then came Capistrano. Tens of thousands flooding through the gates. Fighters and followers and families. The streets could not hold them all. People camped in courtyards. In the lower town. Anywhere there was space. Most could not fight effectively. But they had hands. They could carry stones for wall repairs. Haul water from the rivers. Tend the wounded. Cook for the soldiers. Labor that freed professionals for combat. And they prayed. Constantly. Every church held services around the clock. Hymns echoed through every street. Capistrano led prayers on street corners. In the citadel courtyard. Anywhere people gathered. The constant religious fervor drove some professional soldiers mad. They wanted to prepare. To focus. To think. But for the common defenders, men who knew they were outnumbered, who knew what was coming, the prayers provided something to hold on to besides fear. On July 4, 1456, the Ottoman host appeared on the southern horizon. The sky itself seemed to darken with men. The first thing defenders noticed was not the soldiers. It was the horizon disappearing. From Belgrade's walls, men watched the southern skyline transform. A dark smear spreading across the plains, growing wider by the hour, swallowing fields, swallowing roads, swallowing everything. Then came the sound. A low rumble that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Tens of thousands of feet marching in rough unison. Tens of thousands of hooves. Wagon wheels grinding over dirt roads. The collective noise of an army so vast it created its own weather. July 4, 1456. The Ottoman host had arrived. The deployment took all day. First came the scouts. Akinci raiders on light horses. Ranging ahead to probe defenses. Testing approaches. Reporting back to commanders who were still miles away. Then the vanguard. Provincial infantry in ordered columns. Drums beating steady rhythm. Dust rising in clouds behind them. By midday the main body arrived, and the scale became impossible to deny. Tents sprouted across the plains like mushrooms after rain. Thousands of them. Barracks tents for infantry. Horse lines for cavalry stretching for hundreds of yards. Supply dumps. Field kitchens. Armories. And on the commanding hill overlooking Belgrade, a pavilion of scarlet silk rose above everything else. Gold crescents gleamed on the banners. Guards in polished armor took positions around the perimeter. Sultan Mehmed had arrived. But the defenders' eyes kept drifting to something else. The artillery train. Wagon after wagon rolling into position. Teams of oxen straining against massive loads. Wooden carriages groaning under bronze weight. It took hours to position the guns. Ottoman engineers moved with practiced efficiency. They had done this before. At Constantinople. At a dozen fortresses since. They surveyed the walls. Calculated angles. Measured distances. Marked target points with colored flags visible from the gun positions. The largest bombard required 60 oxen and 3 hours to position. When it was finally in place, gunners built an earthen platform behind it to absorb the recoil. By evening the deployment was complete. Defenders counted banners and tried to estimate numbers. Every Ottoman province had distinct colors. Rumelia, Anatolia, Karaman, Egypt. Each banner represented thousands of men. The counting stopped mattering after a while. The numbers were too large. Whether 60,000 or 80,000 or more, it did not change what the defenders faced. Inside Belgrade's walls, perhaps 30,000 total. Most of them peasants with farm tools. Hunyadi walked the walls that evening with Shalagi. Neither man spoke for a long time. They had both spent decades fighting Ottomans. They had both seen siege preparations before. They knew exactly what those guns meant. Shalagi finally broke the silence. "Can we hold?" Hunyadi did not answer with words. He simply pointed at the Ottoman artillery positions. Then at Belgrade's medieval walls. Stone that had been built to stop catapults and battering rams. Not cannons. The message was clear. Those walls were going to die. The only question was what happened after. July 5th, Day 1. The first cannon fired at dawn. The sound was not just loud. It was physical. A compression of air that punched your chest, stole your breath, made your ears ring before your mind could process what had happened. Birds exploded from trees a mile away. Horses screamed and threw riders. Men on the walls flinched even though the shot had landed nowhere near them. The stone ball, 2 feet in diameter, weighing perhaps 300 pounds, arced through the morning sky and slammed into the lower town's wooden palisade. 20 feet of wall simply ceased to exist. Then the second cannon fired. The third. The 10th. Within an hour, every Ottoman gun was roaring. The bombardment never stopped. Ottoman gunners worked in 3 shifts. 8 hours firing. 8 hours resting. 24 hours a day. The thunder rolled across Belgrade without pause. Day melted into night. Night melted into day. The guns kept firing. The rhythm drilled into your skull. Became the heartbeat of the siege. After 3 days, men could not remember what silence sounded like. Sleep became impossible. You might drift off for an hour. Then another impact would jolt you awake. Your body stayed in constant tension, waiting for the next shot, the next explosion, the next shower of stone fragments. Food lost all taste. Dust coated everything. You ate stone powder with every bite, breathed it with every breath, coughed up gray phlegm that tasted like death, and the walls kept dying. The lower town went first. Wooden palisades that might have stopped arrows exploded into splinters under stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds. By day 3, gaps opened wide enough to march a company through. By day 5, the entire lower town's defenses existed only in scattered fragments. Ottoman infantry moved into the ruins, established forward positions, planted their banners on ground that Christian feet had held for generations. Then Mehmed turned his guns on the citadel. Ottoman engineers understood their craft. They did not spread fire randomly across the walls. That would take forever. Instead, they marked specific points with colored flags, then hammered those points relentlessly. The same section of wall. Hit again, and again, and again. Stone is strong, but stone is also brittle. Hit it enough times in the same place and cracks spread. Mortar turns to powder. Individual stones loosen. Eventually, entire sections collapse. Towers that had stood for 200 years crumbled in days. Breaches opened. First small, gaps where a single man might squeeze through. Then wider. 10 feet, 20 feet, 30 feet. The largest breach appeared where a defensive tower had once stood. The entire tower, 3 stories of solid masonry, reduced to a slope of rubble running down into the moat. Inside the citadel, conditions deteriorated by the hour. Dust hung in the air so thick you could barely see across a street. Men wrapped cloth over their faces and still choked. Stone powder filled your lungs, coated your throat, made every breath painful. The constant noise damaged hearing permanently. Men who had been on the wall since day one could barely hear each other speaking. They communicated with gestures, with shouts that still sounded like whispers through ruined ears. The ringing never stopped. A high-pitched whine that became part of your existence, part of your thoughts, driving some men slowly mad. Blood stained every street. The wounded filled every building that still had a roof. Surgeons worked around the clock, amputating shattered limbs, cauterizing wounds with hot iron, doing whatever they could with medieval medicine, which was not much. The dead accumulated faster than they could be buried. Bodies were carried to the chapel courtyard and stacked against the walls. No time for proper funerals. No space to dig graves. The July heat did its work. The smell became another enemy. But here is what kept the defenders from breaking completely. They were not alone. Every night, work crews scrambled to repair damage. Hundreds of hands. Thousands of hands. Capistrano's crusaders might not know how to fight, but they knew how to work. They hauled stones from ruined buildings to fill breaches. They carried timber for shoring up damaged sections. They built secondary walls behind the worst gaps, crude constructions of rubble and earth that would not stop sustained assault but might slow it. They hauled water from the rivers for the wounded, cooked for the soldiers, carried supplies to positions under fire, did every job that freed professional soldiers for combat. And they prayed, constantly, without ceasing. Capistrano led services in the chapel courtyard, in the streets, on the walls themselves while cannonballs screamed overhead. The professional soldiers thought he was insane, standing exposed on damaged battlements, making himself a target, accomplishing nothing tactical. But the crusaders saw something else. Their friar stood where death fell from the sky, and death did not touch him. If God protected Capistrano, perhaps God would protect them too. The logic was absurd. But faith is not logic. And faith kept men standing when reason said to run. By day 10, Hunyadi knew he needed to change the equation. Defending the walls was not enough. The Ottoman bombardment was too effective. The breaches were widening faster than crews could repair them. In another week, maybe less, the walls would be too broken to hold. He needed to hurt the Ottomans. Badly. In a way they would not expect. He looked at the Danube, and he saw his chance. Mehmed had brought 200 river galleys north. The strategy was textbook siege warfare. Blockade the fortress from the water. Cut supply lines. Prevent reinforcements. Starve them into submission. Ottoman ships anchored in a defensive line below the confluence. Close enough to bombard approaches. Close enough to intercept any boat trying to reach Belgrade. Shore batteries supported the fleet. Small cannon positioned on the banks. Crossfire that would shred any vessel attempting to run the blockade. It was solid strategy. It had worked in previous sieges. It should have worked here. But Mehmed made one miscalculation. He assumed the defenders would stay defensive. Hunyadi had been planning this since before the siege began. While Mehmed was still marching north, Hunyadi had quietly assembled his own fleet. Not warships, there were none available. Fishing boats commandeered from villages along the Danube. Merchant vessels hastily fitted with small cannons. Rafts lashed together and reinforced with timber. 50 vessels total. mismatched, undergunned, crewed by rivermen who had spent their lives navigating the Danube's currents. Against 200 Ottoman galleys, it looked like suicide. It was not suicide. It was calculation. July 14th, Day 10. While Janissaries assaulted the lower town and defenders died in the rubble above, Hunyadi boarded his flagship. His officers begged him to stay in the citadel. He was too weak. The fever was visibly consuming him. He could barely stand some mornings. He ignored them. "If I am going to die anyway, it will not be in a bed." The fleet pushed off from Belgrade's docks, rode the current downstream, built speed as the Danube carried them toward the Ottoman line. Ottoman lookouts spotted them. Signals flashed between ships. But no one reacted with urgency. 50 boats against 200. What could they possibly accomplish? The first surprise was the fire ships. 3 boats packed with everything that burned. Pitch barrels, oil-soaked straw, dry timber, animal fat from the fortress stores. Skeleton crews sailed them toward the Ottoman line. Volunteers who understood they were probably going to die. When they were 100 yards out, they set the fires and jumped into the river. The flames caught instantly. Oil-soaked straw erupted. Pitch burned with thick black smoke. Within seconds, the fire ships were floating infernos. They drifted straight into the Ottoman fleet. Panic erupted on the water. Ottoman galleys were anchored close together. Standard defensive formation. Maximum firepower concentrated in a tight line. But tight lines meant no room to maneuver. Captains screamed for crews to cut anchor lines. Oars tangled between ships as vessels tried to back away. Galleys collided with each other in the chaos. The first fire ship struck an Ottoman galley amidships. Flames spread like plague. Pitch stuck to wood and would not wash off. Rigging ignited. Sails caught. Within minutes, the ship was a blazing wreck. Crew members jumped overboard. But the Danube in July was cold. The current was strong. Men in armor sank. Men without armor were swept downstream. Through the smoke and chaos, Hunyadi's boats attacked. The fighting on the water was brutal. Christian crews pulled alongside Ottoman galleys and boarded. No formations. No tactics. Just scrambling over rails with weapons drawn. Rivermen who had never fought a naval battle killed Ottoman marines on slippery, rocking decks. They used boat hooks and axes. They grappled and stabbed and pushed men overboard. It was chaos. Absolute chaos. But it was Christian chaos against Ottoman confusion. The battle raged for hours. Ships burned and sank around the combatants. Blood mixed with river water. By mid-afternoon, the Ottoman fleet was shattered. At least a dozen galleys captured. More burning or already sunk. The survivors fleeing downstream in disorder. Hunyadi had broken the blockade. Belgrade could be resupplied. The stranglehold was lifted. The victory nearly killed him. Hunyadi collapsed on the deck of a captured galley as the last Ottoman ships disappeared downstream. The fever that had been burning inside him for months surged back with a vengeance. His officers found him unconscious. No pulse they could detect. Skin gray and cold despite the July heat. They thought he was dead. They carried him back to Belgrade. Summoned priests for last rites. Capistrano prayed over his body. Shalagi prepared to take full command. For 2 days Hunyadi burned. Unconscious. Delirious when he surfaced. Calling for men who had died years before. Giving orders for battles long finished. On the 3rd day he opened his eyes and demanded a situation report. The old wolf was not finished yet. But everyone who saw him knew the truth. He had bought them time by spending his life. The fever was eating him faster now. Every effort cost more than he had to give. Across the battlefield, Mehmed received news of the fleet's destruction with cold fury. His admirals blamed the current. The fire ships. Bad luck. He did not want excuses. He wanted Belgrade. New orders went out. No more gradual pressure. No more waiting for starvation. Every soldier would assault the citadel. Every gun would fire until barrels cracked. Everything he had. All at once. Take the fortress or die trying. The final days were grinding horror. July 15th through 20th. The bombardment intensified. Walls that had already been breaking now crumbled faster. Breaches widened beyond any hope of repair. Ottoman miners dug tunnels toward the foundations. Defenders could hear them below. The scrape of shovels. The creak of timber supports. Coming closer every hour. Countermining operations began. Defenders digging their own tunnels. Trying to intercept the Ottoman shafts before they reached the walls. The underground fighting was nightmare fuel. Total darkness. Tunnels barely wide enough to crawl through. Men stabbing with daggers because there was no room to swing. Strangling with bare hands. Sometimes the tunnels collapsed and buried both sides alive. On July 18th, an Ottoman mine succeeded. The explosion lifted 40 feet of wall into the air. Stone and fire and bodies flying outward. The blast killed dozens of defenders. Created a breach that gaped like a wound. Janissaries poured through before the dust settled. Hunyadi led the counterattack personally. 70 years old. Dying of fever. He put on armor and grabbed a sword and walked toward the fighting. His household guard followed. Hungarian knights who had served him for decades. Men who would follow him into hell itself. They hit the Janissaries in the breach. Elite against elite. Steel against steel. No tactics. Just killing. The fighting lasted hours. Bodies piled in the rubble. Blood made the stones slick. Men slipped and fell and were killed before they could rise. By midday the breach was retaken. Ottoman banners torn down. Janissaries driven back. But the cost was devastating. Defenders were bleeding out with every assault. No replacements. No reserves. Every man already committed. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Mehmed had endless reinforcements. Belgrade did not. One more breach. One more assault. And there would not be enough defenders left to hold. If you have made it this far, you understand what these men faced. 18 days of constant bombardment. Walls crumbling around them. Friends dying beside them. Knowing that help was not coming. Knowing that the greatest military power on earth wanted them dead. Share this video. Not for the algorithm. Because 19 days of hell deserves to be remembered. Because ordinary people holding against impossible odds is a story that matters. Now, the final day. July 21st, day 18. The bombardment that morning was unlike anything before. Every Ottoman gun fired simultaneously. Not rotating shifts. Everything at once. The noise was not thunder. It was the world ending. For 6 hours, the citadel disappeared behind clouds of pulverized stone. Visibility dropped to nothing. Men could not see 10 feet ahead. Could not breathe. Could not think. Then suddenly the guns stopped. The silence was shocking. After 18 days of constant thunder, the absence of noise felt wrong. Unnatural. Men looked at each other with hollow eyes. Ears ringing. Unable to process what was happening. Then they looked toward the breaches. Through the settling dust, movement. Shapes emerging. Thousands of shapes. White caps. All the Janissaries. Everyone Mehmed could commit. Advancing in disciplined formations. Not probing. Not testing. This was the final assault. Everything or nothing. The Janissaries hit the breaches within minutes. They did not charge screaming. They advanced in formation. Shields locked in the front rank. Arquebusiers in the second rank firing coordinated volleys. Swordsmen following to exploit any gap. Professional. Methodical. Terrifying in their discipline. These were the same soldiers who had broken Constantinople. The same white caps that had haunted European nightmares for decades. Moving with the precision of men who had trained since childhood for exactly this moment. Hunyadi's troops met them in the rubble. Hungarian knights in half-plate armor. Serbian mercenaries with pole axes. Professional soldiers who knew their business. Fighting shoulder to shoulder in gaps where footing was treacherous and formations meant nothing. Steel rang against steel. Men screamed and fell. Bodies piled in the breaches. The defenders held. Barely. But for every Janissary who dropped, 2 more climbed over the body and kept coming. Fresh troops cycling forward while exhausted defenders had no relief. Gaps started opening in the Christian line. Then the banners appeared. An Ottoman standard rose on the eastern rampart. The crescent moon snapping in the wind over stones that Christians had held for 18 days. then another banner, 50 yards west, then a third near the main gate. The Janissaries were inside, not just at the breaches, inside the citadel, establishing footholds, widening their positions, more troops pouring through behind them. Constantinople had fallen exactly this way. Breaches became footholds. Footholds became bridgeheads. Bridgeheads became collapse. Hunyadi saw it happening, calculated the time remaining. Minutes, maybe less. His professional soldiers were committed. No reserves. Nothing left to throw into the fight. The line was breaking. Then he heard it. A sound that rose from the citadel courtyard. A sound that did not seem human. 25,000 voices, screaming at once. Giovanni di Capistrano had spent the assault praying, while Janissaries climbed the walls, while defenders died in the breaches, while Ottoman banners rose on Christian stone. He knelt in the courtyard with his crucifix raised, surrounded by his crusaders, praying. They had been waiting for this moment. 18 days of bombardment, 18 days of watching walls crumble, 18 days of burying the dead and tending the wounded and wondering when their turn would come. Now Ottoman banners flew inside the citadel. Now the professional soldiers were failing. Now was the moment. Capistrano seized his banner, Christ crucified on white cloth, and ran. Not walked, ran. 70 years old, skeletal from decades of fasting. Legs that should barely have supported him. He sprinted toward the breaches, toward the Janissaries, toward the killing, screaming in Latin, words that most of his followers could not understand, words that did not matter. What mattered was their friar was charging. 25,000 peasants followed. Not in formation. There was no formation. They had never learned formations. A human flood, a wave of bodies, farmers with scythes, old men with clubs, criminals with knives, Serbian refugees with axes, all of them running, screaming, absolutely certain that God himself charged beside them. Hunyadi saw them coming, shouted for them to stop. They did not hear him, would not have obeyed if they had. They hit the Janissaries at the breaches. What happened next should have been slaughter. The Janissaries were the finest infantry in the world, taken as boys from Christian families, converted, trained since childhood, veterans of Constantinople and a dozen other conquests. The Crusaders were farmers who had held weapons for perhaps 3 weeks, wearing work clothes, carrying tools. By every calculation of military science, they should have died in minutes. But calculations do not account for faith, and calculations do not account for sheer numbers. The Crusaders swarmed the breaches like water breaking through a dam. When the first ranks were cut down, and they were cut down, Janissary swords killing men who had never seen real combat, more came behind them, and more, and more. A Janissary would kill one peasant, then another, then a third, then 5 more would tackle him, grabbing arms, grabbing legs, dragging him down through sheer weight. Crusaders who lost their weapons beat armored soldiers with bare fists, with rocks, with anything they could grab from the rubble. They wrestled swords from Janissary hands, used them clumsily but lethally, stabbed and hacked with the desperation of men who believed heaven waited on the other side of death. It was not warfare. It was drowning. The Janissaries were drowning in bodies. The elite infantry began giving ground. Not fleeing. Not yet. Backing up. Trying to create space. Trying to use their superior training. But there was no space. Only more Crusaders. Pushing. Screaming. Dying. Pressing forward over the bodies of their fallen. Hunyadi saw it happening. Could not believe it, but recognized the moment. He rallied every professional soldier he could find. Hungarian cavalry who had dismounted to fight on the walls. Serbian mercenaries who had been held in reserve. His personal guard who had been protecting his position. He led them in a coordinated assault on the Janissary flanks. Now the Ottomans were caught in a vice. Trained soldiers hitting them from the sides with disciplined attacks. A religious mob grinding them down from the front through sheer mass. Their formation, their greatest advantage, fragmenting under pressure from every direction. Sections of the Janissary line began to retreat. Then whole units. Officers shouted orders. tried to maintain cohesion. But the pressure was too much. The retreat became a rout. The Janissaries broke. These soldiers who had never fled a battlefield in living memory, who had broken Constantinople, who had conquered half of Europe, they turned and ran, back through the breaches, back across the rubble, back toward the Ottoman lines. Provincial troops on the flanks saw the elite running and panicked. If the Janissaries could not hold, what chance did anyone have? The rout spread like fire through dry grass. And Capistrano's crusaders, intoxicated with victory and religious ecstasy, did not stop at the walls. They poured out of the fortress, chasing the routing army across open ground. Hunyadi screamed orders to hold position, to consolidate, to not throw away the victory through overextension. No one listened. 10,000 crusaders, maybe more, flooded across the plains toward the Ottoman camp. It should have been suicide. Ottoman cavalry should have regrouped and slaughtered them in the open. Any competent commander would have used the crusaders' lack of discipline against them. But the Ottoman command structure had shattered. With the Janissaries in full retreat, provincial commanders did not know what was happening. Some thought the entire fortress garrison had sortied. Others thought Christian reinforcements had arrived. Confusion spread faster than accurate information. The Crusaders reached the Ottoman camp before organized resistance could form. They fell on the artillery positions like locusts. Gunners, men trained to operate cannons, not fight infantry, were killed before they could grab weapons. Crusaders smashed firing mechanisms with hammers, stuffed rubble down barrels, poured water into powder magazines. The dragons that had murdered Constantinople, that had bombarded Belgrade for 18 days, destroyed in minutes by men who could not read. They raided supply tents, set fires, looted, created total chaos. And in his scarlet pavilion on the hill, Sultan Mehmed II was in danger. Crusaders actually reached the command tent. They did not know whose it was. Most could not read the Ottoman banners. They could not distinguish the Sultan's pavilion from any other important-looking structure. But they could see it was important. Silk walls, gold decorations, guards in fine armor. So they attacked. Mehmed's bodyguards, elite soldiers whose only job was protecting the Sultan, barely got him out in time. They rushed Mehmed out the back of the pavilion as crusaders burst through the front, lifted him onto a horse, formed a protective ring around him as they retreated up the hill. In the confusion, something struck the Sultan. An arrow, a crossbow bolt. Sources disagree on the details. What sources agree on? Mehmed was wounded. He would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. The conqueror of Constantinople, master of an empire stretching from the Danube to the Euphrates, driven from his own command post by a mob of peasants armed with farm tools, wounded by men who did not even know who he was. The fighting raged through the Ottoman camp for hours. By late afternoon, Sipahi cavalry had finally organized counterattacks. They charged crusader groups in the open areas, cut down hundreds. The mob began falling back toward Belgrade, carrying whatever loot they could grab, captured weapons, armor, banners as trophies. By nightfall they were back inside the fortress, exhausted, bloodied, many wounded, but triumphant. That night, Mehmed held council in a hastily erected replacement tent. The losses were catastrophic. The fleet destroyed days earlier. Now the artillery wrecked, camp half-burned, supplies looted, and the Janissaries, his invincible Janissaries, had broken and run. His commanders advised withdrawal. Ottoman sources later claimed Mehmed calmly reassessed strategy. Christian chronicles describe him in a rage, threatening executions, being talked down by advisors. What is certain? The order went out before midnight. Prepare to withdraw. July 22nd, day 19. From Belgrade's shattered walls, defenders watched the Ottoman army march south. The camp was struck methodically. Tents came down in ordered sections. Supply wagons loaded. What remained of the artillery hitched to ox teams. Infantry formed marching columns. Cavalry took rearguard positions. It took all day. By evening, the plains south of Belgrade were empty except for corpses and the debris of failed conquest. The bells began to ring. Not alarm bells. Victory bells. Men who had been certain of death fell to their knees and wept. Professional soldiers who had fought a dozen battles sat down and could not stand back up. Legs shaking from exhaustion and relief. Capistrano's crusaders sang hymns until their voices failed, then kept singing in whispers. Hunyadi stood on the walls, leaning on Shalagi because fever had stolen his ability to stand alone, watching Ottoman banners disappear over the southern horizon. They had won. The victory lasted exactly 3 weeks. Then János Hunyadi died. The fever that had stalked him through the siege finished its work on August 11, 1456. He was 70 years old. He had spent his last strength saving his kingdom. No record preserves his final words. He simply burned out, probably unaware at the end of where he was or what he had accomplished. Giovanni di Capistrano outlived him by 10 weeks. On October 23, 1456, he collapsed mid-sermon in the town of Ilok, dead within hours. The Catholic Church canonized him in 1690. Today he is Saint John of Capistrano, patron saint of military chaplains and jurists. But the peasants who followed him to Belgrade? History does not record their names. They returned to their villages, to fields they did not own, to lords who had risked nothing. They had saved Europe. They received nothing but the promise of heaven. Mehmed lived another 25 years. He conquered new territories, expanded his empire, became one of history's great rulers. But he never attacked Belgrade again. Not once. He had the army. He had the resources. He had every strategic reason to take the fortress that controlled the Danube. But he avoided it for the rest of his life. The wound he received that day never fully healed. He walked with a visible limp until his death. A permanent reminder of the fortress that broke his tide. In Catholic churches around the world, bells ring at noon. Most people do not know why. Pope Calixtus III ordered those bells on July 22, 1456. To commemorate Belgrade's victory. To remind Christendom that God, or faith, or human courage, had stopped the Ottoman advance. 600 years later, the bells still ring. Rung by priests who have forgotten why. For defenders most of the world has forgotten existed. Belgrade should have fallen. By every measure, numbers, weapons, training, resources, it should have been another Constantinople. But a dying warlord who refused to quit. A fanatical friar who made peasants believe they were invincible. And 20,000 farmers who chose faith over fear. They said no. And that no echoed for 70 years. Not until the 1520s did Ottoman armies seriously threaten Hungary again. By then the world had changed. Fortress design had evolved. European armies had modernized. The Renaissance had spread northward in relative peace. 19 days altered the trajectory of empires. Because history is not inevitable. It is made by people who refuse to accept what seems certain. If this story changed how you see history, if you understand now what ordinary people can accomplish against impossible odds, subscribe. Hit the bell. This channel exists to dig up the truths that time tried to bury. And drop a comment. What forgotten moment in history do you think deserves to be remembered? I read every single one. 2 dying old men. An army of farmers with pitchforks. 19 days of hell. That is how empires break. This has been Dark History Exhumed. And now you know what they never taught you.